Welcome back. Welcome back to another episode of Before the Fame. This is your host, Jordan. And today I have a special episode for you guys. We are going to talk the transformation from pain into power, right? So before we get into that, we got to thank the Lord for our many blessings getting us through this week. Today it's going to be another hot day. So get y'all hydration on. Make sure you stay shaded. Whatever you got to do to stay cool. And also, I want to thank or give a shout out to the women yesterday who answered this question of, do you feel like you have life figured out by 30? That's going to be the thing for all of these days. I'm going to continue to ask people that because, I just want to know. I'm curious on how people think that their life is gone or how they've transformed themselves into the person that they are today. And that's going to get us into this episode today. For me, if some of you have gone back to view my episodes or my earlier episodes, I talked a bit about heartbreaks, my pain, things that I've gone through, things that were affecting me mentally, physically. But how do we describe pain? How do we define our pain? Right? So for me, I told you guys that I have a tattoo. It's right here on my chest that says love is pain. But I'm going to switch that up, right? I want to change that because before, when I was younger, I thought that I had to sacrifice my pain in order to receive love from people, right? I thought that I had to go through things that didn't necessarily involve me, right? It didn't involve things that I did to other people, but because other people were going through it as well, I thought I had to shoulder that pain. I thought that I had to endure it in order for people to love me, right? And, there's for some people who grew up in abusive households, if you grew up around people that didn't necessarily nurture you properly, you think that way, right? You think that you have to deal with things a certain way, and that's not necessarily true, right? So we're just going to debunk some things that we went through in our childhood, or some of us went through it later on in life, that doesn't necessarily equate to love, right? It's painful, right? These experiences that we have, they are painful. Some of them will stick with us longer than others. But this is why transformation is so important, right? Because you can't carry that pain into your later parts of life and think that it's okay. You can't carry that and think that you are going to form relationships with people who are going to stick around, right? Because not only do they have their pain to deal with, they have to understand and empathize with your pain, right? So some people, they aren't going to accept what you've went through. They're not going to understand your pain tolerance. And that's another thing we're going to talk about today too. The tolerance for pain for everyone is different, right? Some people can endure a lot more pain. Some people can't think of the thought of pain, right? And a good example of that is one of my good friends, one of my best friends in this world. He used to be afraid of needles, right? And a lot of people are afraid of needles, but we used to talk about getting tattoos. And in high school, that was one thing that he said that he wouldn't do, right? But later on in life, in college, I looked up and I saw that he had tattoos now. So I'm like, this man, he has more tattoos than me, and I got tattoos first. And it was just funny to me because his mindset transformed, right? He went through a great deal of pain as well, to get to that point. But he had to change his mindset of how he thought of needles, right? Because how else are you going to go through getting a tattoo, right? And that's just a little small example of how we can change how we think, right? We can change how certain things that we grew up thinking that we know about, or certain ideas that was planted in our heads, it doesn't have to necessarily define who we are, right? We don't have to be defined by, our earlier beliefs. And that's the power in us, right? Because we have free will. We have, things that we don't have to accept as our truth, right? And sometimes that is the power, right? Just accepting that as our truth is just as powerful as accepting it as not the truth. So now, before we get too deep into this conversation as well, I also want to define what power that I'm talking about, because we're not just talking about the strength of man. We're not talking about, you going to the gym or anything like that. We're talking divine powers, right? So we're talking compassion. We're talking empathy. We're talking love. We're talking faith, hope, all of those things that we reiterate daily, right? We showcase this daily. We just don't think of it as our powers. We don't think of it as our gifts. But these are the things that describing when I say transforming our pain, the things that we went through physically, emotionally, spiritually, and transforming that into divine power. And it's not going to just happen just because we want it to, right? We're not just able to let go of things so easily, or at least some of us. Some of us are, right? A lot of us can detach from the world and what happened to us easier than others, but it's not always easy, right? Some of it is going to stick with us for the rest of our lives. Certain pains that I deal with today, this is stemming from my childhood, and we're going to talk about some of that today. And one of the earliest ones that I can remember, I've told you guys about this before, was a punishment that my uncle had us do, which was write out the Bible. And, of course, back then it was just like, it was psychological, right? It was more so of like what he wanted us to learn through it. But now I think of it more as a teaching moment. It was a lesson behind that, to one, never forget where you came from, right? Never forget who has the order in your household, right? Because sometimes our children can outnumber us, but you have to show them who has the order, right? Who is supposed to be taking orders from who, and who is supposed to be respecting who, right? We're all supposed to respect each other, but you have to initiate that as the parent or the guardian, to let them know that, hey, you're the child, stay in the child's place. And we heard that a lot too, right? Growing up, stay in the child's place, stay in the child's place. But what does that mean, right? Staying out of grown folks' business, allowing them to handle what responsibilities, which most of us as kids, some of us, knew about it, some of us didn't. But when you have a ordered household, that level of responsibility isn't always on the child, right? Some of it is, right? Cleaning up your room, that's on you, right? Doing your chores, that's on you. But when it comes to paying bills, when it comes to making sure things around the house are fixed, making sure that, all the responsibilities are taken care of, that isn't always on us, right? And for me, I came into responsibilities earlier, around 15, 16. After losing my mom, it was tough on us, for a while. We had to accept that she was gone. We had to start the process of moving, and things happened so quickly, right? It happened so quickly. I lost my mom in June. We moved out by April of the next year into our new home. And for me, it was just like I didn't have time to process that. I didn't have time to sit with my pain and truly understand how I felt about it, right? I just had to keep moving. I had to stay strong. I had to graduate from high school. And for my brother, I felt like he had it even tougher because this was his senior year going into college. So he really didn't have time to process it and understand it the way that I did. I felt like I had a little bit more time to, get my affairs in order, but he was going off to college in a whole nother state. So it really felt like we were thrust into this new life, right? And again, for most people, they're dealing with that now or maybe later on in life. But I agree that God made this happen for a reason. He wanted us to see how the people in our lives were going to react to our pain, right? Some of the people, they were looking at us to see how we would react to our pain. And that is why when we get to that point of enlightenment, maturity, right, we understand things better. We don't fully understand it, right? We don't fully understand why it happens until it's our turn, right? Until it's our turn to go through our death, or, some of us, just don't want to call it that, our transition. It's a very, very enlightening experience, right? You want to make things right. You want to teach people around you about what you're going through, but it's kind of tough, right? And some of the things that I learned from my mom's passing, it prepared me for what would happen next, right? And for me, what happened next, I lost my grandfather 2 years later, which was after my senior year. And that experience was just as painful, but I felt like I was prepared for it a little bit more. My grandfather stayed about 30 minutes away from us in Manchester, Georgia. So, we would go down there to visit him and talk to him and spend some time with him. But we didn't necessarily have those bonding moments like I did when I was younger, right? Because he wasn't as close, because we, as a family, we had things that transpired in my younger days that I didn't understand, right? I couldn't understand why I couldn't spend time with my grandfather, but he was with his family in Manchester, and I was staying with my aunt and her husband at the time. So that was just how life was. But now, again, as a almost 30-year-old, I see that it was for the best. And I'm glad that I was able to get those moments with him before his passing. So when it came, or when that time came, I wasn't as hurt by it, right? I wasn't as shocked by the news. I was still sad. I was still grieving, right? But I knew that with him, there was a moment that we went down, and the first moment that he realized that his daughter, his middle child, was no longer with us, that was one of the saddest moments for me, right? Or for me, the memorable moments that I had with my grandfather, because he asked for her, and we had to tell him that she had passed, right? And that's when I noticed that people don't accept their pain, or they don't accept what happened at the same rate, right? Some of us are going through things that is not only holding us back, is giving us a different perspective on life, right? And for me, while I had to experience that, I had to live in the house that my mother passed away in. He lived miles and miles away, and he had to hear that, in person with us. And it was a sad moment, man. It was very sad. He cried out for her. And after his passing, I felt like it was a more freeing moment, not only for him, but for me as well, because I knew that not only that had this man had to live his life without his wife, he had to live his life without one of his children, or two of his children, sorry. And it was just time for him to let go of a lot of things. And to see that, to see him accept the death of his child, it was one of those moments where I said to myself, I knew that I wasn't that strong, right? I knew that, I've seen a lot of things in my lifetime, but I hadn't dealt with that level of pain. And for me, like I said, it was just time for me to step up, and be a man, face the music, as they say. So growing past that, growing past my little brother's passing in 2008, it was a lot of things that I say to myself, like, I went through so much in such a little time, but I managed to stay positive about this because I have the Lord, right? And growing up in the church, growing up around church folk, it was times where, people, they wanted to be around, but they couldn't, or, they sacrificed time to be around, and I'm thankful for that. But my growth came when I was by myself, right? And I don't just mean like relationship wise, but, when I'm away from family, when I'm away from my friends, when I'm away from anybody that wanted to be there, that's when the growth came, right? And that's when, people who wasn't around, they didn't know that I was growing my hair out. Some people, they still haven't seen my locks in person, but it was just like that period of me being homeless, that period of me being away from family, that was when the most growth happened to me, right? And those years, that was around 2017 through 2020, those years were some of the worst and best times of my life. I was around a lot of people who, some weren't, you know, able to make it to today, and some are still here today. And I always just thank them for being there, right? Not for giving me money, or not for seeing to it that my brother and I had a roof over our heads, but I just thank them for being there, for being listening, for respecting us enough to even get us to this point, right? And I tell you guys a lot, but this wouldn't be possible without my brother Brandon Pope. He made sure that I wasn't leaning too much on him or anyone else, right? We had to make sure that we were strong individuals, not just for our family, but for ourselves. And this is why when I talk about my tattoos, when I talk about my life, when I talk about anything that I had growing up, my conversations with Brandon, it mirrored all of that, right? Because he had been through some similar things. He had been through a lot of pain. He had been through heartbreaks. He had been through losing friends. And through all of that, the man kept going. He kept going. He was into the nightlife. He was into the DJ life. And that's why when I create, I do it for him. I do it for my mother. I do it for my grandfather, my brothers. I do it for Josiah. All of these people who we've been through collectively shared pain, right? We shared those burdens and we didn't necessarily allow that to hold us down, right? And that's why when we talk about transformation, when we talk about our mindset, you can't wake up with the mindset that you have to do it alone, right? Sometimes you got to do things alone, right? We understand that, but we can't do everything alone, right? Some of this stuff we have to allow God and God's people to shoulder that load for us. And that can be hard too for some people who grew up so independent, who didn't really have a support system. That could be hard to do. But this is why, again, in order for us to transform, in order for us to think of our life as a life of power and act on that power, we must transform, right? A butterfly cannot turn into a butterfly without being a caterpillar first. And that caterpillar has to go through a process of transformation, metamorphosis, right? We have to form in our cocoon alone. And this is what I mean when I say there's times that we are alone, and that's when the most growth happens. That's when the most transformation happens. So for you who are in your cocoon right now, you may be on your way to do something that's extraordinary, right? But you may be going through some pain right now. You may be going through some grief right now. You may be going through losses right now. You may be going through the worst heartbreak of your life right now. But I kid you not, if you go through it, if you continue going through it, if you continue to believe, you continue to have hope, you continue to love others as yourself, you will make it through. Everything is going to feel worth it in the end. It's not always about you understanding why you went through it, right? Sometimes you're not going to understand it. Sometimes you're just going to feel lost about it. You're going to have to continue to go to God. And that's what he wants you to do, right? He doesn't want you to stop going to him, right? It may be hard. You may have the tough conversation. You may have to make some changes in your life, but as long as you keep going to God about it, everything will be all right. And you won't have to shoulder it by yourself. You won't have to answer these questions for yourself. But now that you have the wisdom, now that you have the insight on it, now you don't have to go through life so scared. You don't have to be aware of what's happening around you, right? Because while you may going through your season of focus, somebody may be going through their season of distraction. And while you're going through your season of balance, somebody may going through their season of imbalance, right? A lot of us are going through our season of imbalance because we don't know how it feels to be balanced. We don't know how it feels to have two parent households. We don't know how it feels to have both of our parents stay married for X amount of years. We just don't know, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't have it for yourself. That doesn't mean that your children has to go through the same cycle, right? We can change how our pain affects us. We can change how we view our pain. We can change our definition of what pain is. And this is why I say my tattoo, I'm going to get it redone eventually, because love is not pain to me. Love is 1 Corinthians 13. And we're going to keep pushing that. We're going to keep understanding ourselves better, keep knowing who we are, because who we are is not necessarily a reflection of our upbringing, right? I know some of you parents out there, you think that you had to raise your children a certain way because you were raised that way, but I'm going to challenge you to think or rethink how you raise your child, right? Because if you wanted your children to have another version of their grandparents, fine, continue doing how you do. But if you want your child to view you for who you truly are, it starts with you being honest, right? And even better than that, it starts with you being transparent on how you want them to be, right? Because you can be transparent about your life, right? But as soon as you bring a child into this world, it's not about you anymore, right? It's not about you and how you want things to go, but you got to start thinking about how they want their lives to go, right? And it's not also about you just steering them into the right direction either. It's about you allowing them to make the right choices, having free will, right? And we didn't really get into that this episode, but free will is definitely important when it comes to choosing pain or choosing power. We have that will to decide either we're going to let this hurt us, or we're going to let this strengthen us. Are we going to let this weigh us down, or are we going to let this lift us up and invite wisdom to guide us into the right path? Because not only does this help us further in life, but this help us raise our children to go further, right? To achieve more, to see more, to do more. And I know that's what, for most parents, they want their children to experience life in a better circumstance than they did when they grew up. So this is why I say, for this episode, if you don't take anything else from it, take the fact that your pain does not define you. Your pain, what happened to you in your childhood, your young adulthood, even what happened to you yesterday, does not define you. You have to get up. You have to redefine yourself, redefine how you think, transform into a person of power, a person of divine power. Transform yourself from a person who grew up hating this group of people or disliking this group of people to loving those group of people, right? Because if anything, when you get to that point of, hey, I'm healed now, I feel better about myself, I'm loving myself, I'm able to share that love, you don't have room for hate, right? You don't have room to be spiteful or anything like that, vengeful. You don't have room for that. But you know what you do have room for? You always have room for faith. You're going to always have room for hope. You're going to always have room for love. So that's just it. That's all we have room for today. That's all we're going to have room for tomorrow. The best thing about it is you'll never run out of it. You'll never run out of it. Just think about that. If it's all up here and it's all something that's God given, you'll never run out of it. So this is why I say, man, life is short. Life is taken away, right, by our mistakes, sometimes our decisions. But the things that's God given, we never run out of it. And this is why our power will always outweigh our pain, right? No matter how much we went through, how much we think that it hurt us, our power always outweighs our pain. And that's just it, man. That's the episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys realize that you are more powerful than your pain. And that is a wrap for Before the Fame. This is your host, Jordan. Catch me on it next time, next week. We're going to get into a deeper conversation about how we can transform ourselves.